A man in a rubber caveman mask walked across a university parking lot, trapped 7 wild crows, banded their legs, and let them go. Nothing more happened that day. No harm, no chase, just a mask, a net, and a release. But 5 years later, crows who had never been touched, crows who hadn't even been born yet during that first encounter, were still diving at anyone who dared to wear that same mask across campus. How does a bird pass down a memory of a face it never saw form? That single mask, still worn by researchers decades later, has become one of the strangest ongoing experiments in animal behavior, and it forces us to ask a question that sounds almost absurd. Do crows recognize us the way we recognize each other? Not shapes, not colors, not silhouettes, faces. I've spent months following this mystery, and the deeper I went, the less I understood the boundary we've drawn between human minds and bird minds. Somewhere out there, a crow may be watching you right now, filing away the details of your face into a memory that could outlast your own. This investigation begins in a city most of us walk through without a second thought toward the birds above us. Crows are everywhere. We see them on power lines, in parking lots, picking through trash near restaurants. We rarely look twice. But for decades, researchers in Seattle have been looking very closely, because what they discovered changed how science understands the corvid mind entirely. In the early 2000s, wildlife biologist John Marsleff wanted to know whether crows could distinguish between individual humans. So he and his team wore distinct masks while trapping crows on a university campus. One dangerous mask worn during the capture, and one neutral mask worn by someone who simply walked by without incident. Then they waited. What happened next unsettled even the scientists. Crows who had been trapped began scolding, mobbing, and dive-bombing anyone wearing the dangerous mask, while completely ignoring the neutral one. That alone might be explained by simple memory. A bird remembering a bad experience isn't shocking. But then something stranger happened. Crows that had never been captured, crows that hadn't even hatched yet during the original trapping, started attacking the same mask. The hostility was spreading through the population, passed from parent to offspring, from neighbor to neighbor, like a rumor moving through a city that never forgets. This wasn't instinct. This was culture. Somewhere between one generation and the next, a specific, learned piece of information, "This face means danger," had been transmitted socially. Crows were teaching each other who to fear, based on a memory none of the students had personally lived through. To understand how a brain the size of a walnut could accomplish this, researchers turned to neuroscience. In follow-up studies, crows exposed to threatening human faces were placed under a PET scanner, and their brains showed heightened activity in regions functionally similar to the amygdala, the same structure that lights up in the human brain during fear and threat recognition. In other words, when a crow sees a face it associates with danger, something happens in its brain that echoes what happens in ours. This raises an uncomfortable and fascinating question. If the underlying neural response looks similar, is the experience similar too? Is a crow, in some limited but real sense, afraid of you specifically? Not humans in general, you. Here's where the mystery deepens further, because facial recognition in birds isn't limited to fear. Pigeons, birds most of us dismiss as background noise in a city square, have been shown in laboratory studies to distinguish between individual human faces and to retain that recognition even when the person changes clothing. In some experiments, pigeons could still identify a familiar handler wearing an entirely different outfit, suggesting the birds weren't relying on clothing cues at all, but on facial structure itself. If pigeons, birds without the enormous relative brain size of corvids, can hold on to facial memory, then perhaps this ability isn't some rare evolutionary miracle confined to a few genius species. Perhaps it's more widespread than we assumed. Perhaps it's simply been sitting in plain sight, in birds we walk past every single day, without imagining they might be quietly building a memory of us. It's worth asking why this ability would evolve at all. Facial recognition is metabolically expensive. Building and maintaining the neural architecture to distinguish one human face from thousands of others, and to attach memory and emotional weight to that distinction, costs energy a small bird can't easily spare. Evolution rarely keeps something that expensive around unless it pays for itself. And in an urban landscape, it clearly does. Cities are full of individual humans behaving in wildly different ways towards crows.
some throwing stones, some tossing bread, some simply walking past.
A crow that can't tell these people apart has to treat every human as an equal, unknown risk. A crow that can tell them apart gets to be selective. It can flee from the one who once threw a rock and comfortably feeds 6 feet from the one who never has. In a world increasingly shaped by human presence, that distinction isn't a curiosity, it's a survival advantage. Arguably one of the reasons crows, unlike so many other wild species, have thrived rather than vanished alongside us. If mysteries like this fascinate you, if you've ever looked twice at a crow on a wire, wondering what it knows about you, this is exactly the kind of hidden world we explore here every week. Subscribing means you won't miss the next investigation into the minds hiding inside the birds around us. Now, back to the crows. Because facial recognition alone doesn't explain everything researchers found. It explains fear, it explains caution, but it doesn't fully explain what happened next in the Seattle studies, which is perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire investigation. The crows didn't just avoid the dangerous mask, they began to associate it with something closer to moral judgment. Birds that saw the dangerous mask being scolded by other crows learned to fear it too, even without ever being harmed themselves, and even without direct social contact with the birds doing the scolding. Simply witnessing the reaction was enough to install the association. This is a phenomenon closer to what psychologists call social referencing, using another individual's emotional reaction to decide how to feel about something you've never personally experienced. Humans do this constantly.
A child who sees a parent flinch at a barking dog often grows up wary of dogs without ever having been bitten. What the Seattle crows demonstrated was strikingly similar, an entire population building a shared, inherited threat map of specific human faces purely through observation and cultural transmission, sustained now for well over a decade. Compare this to other corvids. Ravens, close cousins of crows, have shown similarly sophisticated social cognition, remembering which individuals, bird or human, cheated them during food exchanges and adjusting their trust accordingly in future interactions. Magpies have passed mirror self-recognition tests, a benchmark once thought reserved for great apes, dolphins, and elephants. Across the corvid family, a pattern keeps repeating. These are not simple, instinct-driven animals. They are building internal models of the individuals around them, models that include us. Jays, another corvid relative, have even demonstrated the ability to remember not just what food they hid, but where and how long ago, adjusting their caching strategy based on how quickly a particular type of food spoils. That kind of forward-planning memory was once considered a hallmark of human cognitive uniqueness, and that reframes something we rarely consider. We assume we are the ones observing the birds, watching them from a window, photographing them in a park, feeding them from a balcony. But across cities and campuses worldwide, it appears the observation has always run in both directions. Think about how many mornings you've heard crows calling before you were even.
Most of us assume that relationship is one-sided, that we are the only ones paying attention. The evidence now suggests otherwise. Personally, I find this the most disorienting part of the entire investigation. We tend to imagine intelligence and memory as things happening on one side of the glass, inside human minds, occasionally glimpsed in a few smart species like chimpanzees or dolphins. But a crow outside your window may already have a file on you, your face, your patterns, whether you're a threat, a neutral presence, or in some documented cases, a reliable source of food, remembered and greeted individually year after year. There are still enormous mysteries left unanswered. Scientists don't yet know exactly how long an individual crow can retain a specific human face, whether it's years or potentially an entire lifespan of up to 20 years in the wild. Nor do they fully understand how facial memory is encoded and passed between generations who never witnessed the original event, only that it happens with remarkable consistency. What we do know is this: somewhere in a walnut-sized brain, without language, without writing, without any of the tools we consider essential to memory and culture, a bird can hold on to the shape of your face, decide what it means, and teach that meaning to its children. Maybe the story we've told ourselves, that memory, judgment, and social learning belong primarily to us, was never quite accurate. Because faces aren't the only impossible thing birds seem to remember. somewhere above our heads, a much larger mystery is unfolding every single spring and autumn. Birds that have never flown a route before, guiding themselves across entire continents to the exact same tree, the exact same rooftop, the exact same square meter of forest, as though the map itself were written somewhere inside them. How do they know the way home? That is where we